안녕하십니까. 제17회 제주 포럼에 참석해 주신 여러분 반갑습니다. 지금부터 평화로운 사이버 공간 구축을 위한 사이버 안보 규범의 현황과 쟁점 세션을 시작하겠습니다. 본 세션은 동시 통역이 제공되며 통역을 원하시는 분들께서는 자리에 놓여져 있는 통역 수신기를 사용해 주시기 바랍니다. 한국어는 5번, 영어는 6번에서 제공됩니다. 그러면 세션의 진행을 맡은 님은 박노형 고려대학교 법학전문대학원 교수님이십니다. 박노형 교수님은 경제법을 중심으로 개인정보 보호, 사이버 안전, 디지털 통상에 관한 법 및 협상, 조정을 담당하고 계십니다. 또한 사단법인 한국국제경제법학회 초대 회장을 역임하셨고 현재 한국통상법제연구소 소장, 사단법인 국제사이버법 연구회 회장, 고려대학교 사이버법센터 소장 및 사단법인 국제조정센터 이사장을 맡고 계십니다. 그러면 이제 마이크를 좌장님께 넘기겠습니다. 좌장님 진행 부탁드립니다.
네, 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much. As introduced, my name is Park No-hyung. I'm the professor from Korea University School of Law. And during this session, we are joined with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and with Cyber Law Center of Korea University. We're talking about building up peaceful cyberspace. So a few introductions. And I am with our excellent interpreter, so I will just keep talking in Korean. So the cyber norms is our subject. So the cybersecurity norms, it started in 1998 when Russia actually wanted to do that, and it went on to UN. And starting 2004, it went on to UNGG, Group of Governmental Experts. Actually, it was installed, and we had 6 sessions since. And between these times, we had this open-ended working group, OEWG, and there was once in 2020, and now from 2021 to 2025, we have our second OEWG. So interestingly, at the UNGG, the UN-related cybersecurity discourse actually started from Russia, and this OEWG, when it transitioned from OEW to GG2 OEWG, actually that was Russia's intention. And GGA OEWG is at the UN First Committee. And now the UN Third Committee, at the UN Third Committee, they are talking about this cyber crime. So there is an add-on committee going on right now, and there was the first talks with this year's February and March. Again, this cybersecurity was first called by Russia. So these are the current situations. And currently, the OEWG is acting right now. It is working on. And there was the third practical meeting back in June. And we published the annual progress report, and it was adopted as a consensus. So given these facts, in this committee, the cybersecurity and its norms and related talks are very actively discussed. But on the other hand, it's been already 20 years, but there were no major improvements yet. Nevertheless, the results of these talks in US, I believe, there are like 2 or 3 factors I want to mention. Number 1, the UN-led cyber agenda is about to be finished. from all the way to threats to application of international law and voluntarily norms and capacity building. So actually the framework has been made. And more importantly, the cyberspace is something that man created. It is a new space. And when we look at the times before that, the international law, the UN Charter, actually it's very interesting that all these norms and laws are actually implicated in the cyberspace also, and that was approved by the UN, and we have no issues about that. But then, how to apply international law in the cyberspace? It is another issue that we have to talk about. There is a heated debate among the countries. So today, we will talk about the general cybersecurity and its norms among countries. We have two prominent experts as panelists and three prominent experts as discussants from Korea. So our two panelists, experts from abroad, they couldn't join us here, so they're just connected online. So actually, they are our guests for our two panelists. Let me give you 15 minutes each. And for our discussants, maybe you can use 7 minutes each. So I am given 80 minutes, but I plan to do only 60 minutes. Then after that, we will be able to take questions, if any, and we will be able to do some further discussions. Our first speaker, Director Fergus Hansen of International Cyber Policy Center from Australia. He's the director of the center. Director Hansen actually visited us years ago in this very session. Personally, when it comes to Director Hansen, I always read this daily cyber digest from his center. This is a daily newsletter, almost daily newsletter. It's very intuitive and it gives much good information about the cybersecurity. So I want to thank Director Hansen for all the good newsletters. So without further ado, Director Hansen, you have 15 minutes for your presentation. Then we will go to our next presenter.
Professor Park, thank you so much for that very kind introduction and also for the plug about the Daily Digest. Please do sign up, it's a great product. It's really a pleasure to be invited to join you again today, Jeju. I just wish I could be there in person, but I guess we can settle for second best with the online version. So I was asked to talk about the evolving threats in the cyber domain and what we can do to promote international cooperation. And so let me just start with the big picture. And first of all, on the positive side of things, we're seeing improvements in cybersecurity in lots of areas. I'm sorry, Professor Park, are you able to hear me okay? I'm getting a bit of feedback here.
It's okay, but it brings a little bit of howling.
Can proceed.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so on the positive side of things, we're seeing improvements in cybersecurity in lots of areas. Lots of companies developing more secure products Two-factor authentication is getting increasing take-up. Governments are investing more in hardening their defence and raising awareness. More companies are taking cybersecurity seriously and hardening their systems. Ukraine has demonstrated the ability to successfully counter disinformation from one of the world's most sophisticated disinformation actors. So we're seeing lots and lots of really good examples of cybersecurity improving. But the overall trend, unfortunately, is still a negative one for me. The attack surface is getting bigger. We're seeing the Internet of Things connecting more and more devices to the Internet with low levels of security. Businesses and governments everywhere have undergone a massive expansion of their digital footprints, driven by the work from home trend that the COVID-19 pandemic initiated. And this was often done quickly with limited attention to security risks. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has seen the mobilisation of vigilantes on both sides, leading to what the former head of the NSA, Mike Rogers, described on our podcast as a watershed moment for cyber. These large numbers of individuals let loose on the internet without really going through any or much due diligence to make sure they're not going to break things along the way. On the cyber criminal front, we're also seeing this enduring phenomenon of impunity. There's really no or very little cost for cyber criminals for engaging in this activity. And at the nation-state level, we're seeing the development of state military cyber capabilities in all countries in our region to differing levels and professional standards. And I think the lack of transparency about the development of those capabilities and also telegraphing and talking about the use cases for those capabilities is problematic from the point of view of regional stability. Now, sorry, I hope this sounds okay. I'm getting some strange feedback here. If I'm going to look at the evolving threats, I think I was going to mention 5. The first one is very familiar to everyone, I'm sure. The ransomware phenomenon that is tearing through our business community at the moment. There seems to be no sign that it's abating, and our responses to it are still really adequate. I take a fairly strong view on this, that we need to take some much more assertive action, and I'm in the camp of people that think we should look at issues like banning the payment of ransomware payments. I think if you look at some of the emerging evidence coming out of the war in Ukraine and the sanctions that have been levied against Russia, there's evidence that cyber criminal gangs in Russia are relocating their shop fronts to other countries because of the fact that companies based in the United States and elsewhere are concerned about making those payments because it might risk violating the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. Now, I think that's fairly good evidence that if we went to a platform of banning ransomware payments, that it might very well be effective in terms of deterring cyber criminals from targeting our companies. Another evolving threat I think we face is on the 5G and 6G front. Here we're expanding again our attack surface and also adding in new applications and use cases that we haven't even thought of yet that will also come with cybersecurity risks. And because we're starting to attach large physical objects like cars and trucks and other devices, it also comes with increased threat to life. The third threat I was going to face is IP theft. It had a bit of a flourish during the Obama-Xi meeting and subsequent agreements that came through the G20 and other bilateral agreements. It's died off a little bit in terms of the attention it receives internationally, but I think it still remains a very real and present threat to industry all over the world. It tends to have a focus on US companies, but I think that's largely a perception issue. We're seeing evidence of threats to IP all across the region, including here in Australia. So I think that is an issue that we really need to be focusing in on, the drain that it poses to our economies. The fourth issue is surveillance technologies, content control and censorship and internet restrictions. The challenge there, I think, is twofold. One is the threat that they pose to citizens in terms of human rights and all over the world, but particularly in authoritarian states and the export of those technologies to authoritarian states around the world. But also, I think there's an issue for our own societies. In democratic countries, there's a real incentive to use some of these technologies for things like genuine law enforcement purposes. But I don't think we've yet thought through how we can articulate frameworks that make sure that we adopt these technologies within the context that preserves the democratic values and principles that we hold so dear. Finally, I thought I'd mention the threat posed by the pervasiveness of digital infrastructure, which is dominated by a few companies operating from even newer countries. There's obviously the supply chain risk we have through such market concentration, but there's also the issue of potentially adopting some of these technologies from states that we can't necessarily rely on when it comes to supply chain. So what should we do about promoting international cooperation and regional confidence building measures? For me, we should definitely take a regional approach. There's a tendency for our national cybersecurity policy to look at that in isolation, but it's intimately tied to the geostrategic environment in which we live. The level of maturity and resilience in our national digital ecosystems, and also our ambitions. But most of all, the effectiveness of our cybersecurity policy rests on the ability to forge partnerships with industry, civil society, and the technical community within our own borders, as well as internationally with our government agencies. It's in partnerships where cybersecurity policy has its strength. In industry and in government, they talk about cyber being a team sport. So we shouldn't limit our mental frameworks to just Australia or just Korea. But to me, we need to think about how Australia and Korea's strong points can supplement each other in extending support to each other, but also to our partners in the region. There's also, I think, an urgent need to build a shared understanding. And I mean a really genuine shared understanding, not just an agreed common understanding. So an example I'll give you is with the ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum, where members have agreed to a points of contact directory, but that directory is really just a paper reality. No one generally worked through it, exercised it, let alone actually used it. But a points of contact directory is really a really minimum baseline regional confidence building measure. So if we can move beyond agreements to actual shared understanding, then I think that's going to be a key piece to getting us to a greater international stability and regional cooperation. I apologise if the audio has been terrible. I'm getting a lot of feedback here. I hope it hasn't been the same there. Professor Park, thank you very much, and I'll hand back to you.
그 시간을 잘 지켜주.
So you keep your time frame. Thank you very much. So again, as you've heard, the cybersecurity trends are covered by Professor Hansen. Thank you very much. And the GGE, OE, WG formats, all these kind of existing and future threats are also covered by Director Hansen. Thank you very much. I want to emphasize threats related to internet. You also mentioned that. And at our second round, I want to tell you that soon internet or telecom unions and this ITU Secretary General will be newly elected. And of course, it's an international body, but ITU is more technology oriented. So this place of Secretary General is quite highly debated whether it will be US or Russia. So there's a kind of interest about this chair. So how the internet will go in where it will go in the future. So maybe Director Hansen, you can comment on that in our second round. So this is my question as a moderator. Our second presenter is from Japan. Professor Ishii. And actually, Professor Ishii is her family name. So Professor Ishii Eureka, she is Associate Professor at National Defense Academy of Japan.
사실 한국이
So in Korea, in China, or in Japan, I believe the collaboration between the three countries means a lot for us. And we don't have many cybersecurity experts as professor, but today we have Professor Ishii. Thank you, Professor Yu, for inviting her. And again, Professor Ishii, you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, Professor Park. I'd like to start off by thanking the organizers for having me in this forum. It is my great honor to be part of this important session. So with that, let me share the slide. Sorry, the organizer is sharing the slide, so maybe we don't have to go through the slide by myself. So can you quickly turn to the next page, please? Thank you. So as Dr. Hansen mentioned, the current version of the word, both sides using the cyber attack as a method of warfare. And today I'd like to talk about the issues concerning voluntary hackers in international conflict from the perspective of public international law, since my specialty is public international law. So although both sides are using hackers, Ukraine, for the first time in the history, called for the hackers across the globe to conduct the hostile activities against Russia. And at the very initial stage, already it had about 30,000 hackers registered to its Telegram. The question here, what is the state of ITR and international humanitarian law, and what is the significance of such practice? To explore this, I'd like to first overview the structure of the army, and then go through the rules of international humanitarian law, and then I will assess the status of the army and briefly note the stance of such in future conflicts. Next page, please. So the structure of the army is not really announced, but basically it is organized through social network media or and most importantly, Telegram channel where new Russian targets are listed for volunteers. And the targets are mainly Russian infrastructures and financial services. For example, hackers from Ukraine's anti-army targeted the websites of the Moscow Stock Exchange and Russian lender Silva with DDoS attack. And although the attack itself was done from the voluntary hacker, the government and showed its plan. Next page, please. So my concern is that those kind of voluntary hackers do not fit in the existing international law. So for your information, this is the list of the things that are relevant to the present situation. But basically, they regulate the conduct of the combatants that we will see in a minute. Also, we should note that IHL applies in the cyber domain if the attack is done in the context of armed conflict, but it is not so easy to ascertain whether the attack is done in the context of armed conflict. Next page, please. Okay, so here I prepared a slide in the last file. Okay, I'll briefly explain the structure of IHL. So basically, if the hacker enjoys the status of combatants, then they do have the right to participate directly in activities. It can, attack the military objects of the enemy, and it can attack the combatants of the other side. And the combatants are provided the additional protocol, the first additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions, AP1, Article 43, which we are looking at now. Basically, that the members of armed forces with a couple of restrictions are combatants. Besides, militias and volunteers that do not belong on armed forces are also under HAC regulations. There's a category called leve and mass, which is also listed as. Now, if the hacker is a combatant, as I mentioned, it can lawfully attack the infrastructure of Russia. But if the hackers are not a combatant, then it is categorized as a civilian, and there's no such a right to conduct the hostile activities. And basically, they are protected from the attack. However, if the civilian engaged in a direct hostility, then it does not, excuse me, it loses the protections that is provided by the national humanitarian law. So, next slide. Excuse me. So this is a slide that explains the status of civilian population. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this is that explains the concept of direct participation in hostilities. And there are disputes regarding the concept of direct participation in hostilities. But SRC explains that if the conduct satisfies the three-pronged test, then characterized the direct hostilities, and the civilian will receive the protection. So the first is the so-called threshold of harm, which is that the act must be likely to adversely affect the administration or military security, or alternatively to inflict death, injury, or destruction of persons or objects protected against direct attack. The second test is the direct competition. There must be a direct causal link between the act and the harm likely to result either from that act or from coordinated operation of that act constitutes an integral part. Lastly, the act must be specifically designed to directly cause the required threshold of harm in support of to conflict and to the detriment of another. We call it as a belligerent method. So these are the three-pronged tests. Next slide, please. So let me briefly go through the assessment of the conduct of voluntary haka. Now, obviously, they are not the combatants because they are not a part of the force of Ukraine. Of course, they are the combatant members that conduct cyber operation in Ukraine army, but the IT army itself is not a part of Ukraine's armed force. So, mentioned there. However, as I mentioned, if they conduct the hostilities that satisfies the three-pronged test that we looked at, then possibly be characterized as direct participation in hostilities, and it may lose the protection. Then what? Maybe if the Russian side is successful in identifying the attackers, then it may counterattack the hackers. However, if the hackers is in a territory of the neutral state, then there is a rule saying that the parties to the armed conflict cannot violate the territorial integrity of a third state. So it is difficult for the advisor state to conduct the physical attack, although not theoretically from the option. Now, whether Ukraine is responsible for the hacking or any other attacks done by the IT army members is a different question than the status of or whether the hackers' rights and obligations under international humanitarian law. However, since the IT army members are civilians, has to argue that the act is attributable to or Ukraine is responsible for encouraging them to attack Russian infrastructures. The parliament said that the state has the effective control and the acknowledgement and adoption of the action of its own then it is responsible for the act. However, as you the threshold are high. So in the future international armed conflict, I think the state may use these volunteer hackers because it could, save its cost losses. However, my fear is that may end up in a situation where states, exploit the gaps in the law. So, for future purposes, international cooperation on cyber governance is necessary to secure the possible behavior of the parties. So I will stop here, and thank you so much for your attention.
네, 이시희 교수님 고맙습니다.
Thank you, Professor Ishii. What is happening in Ukraine is devastating, and regarding that matter, it was an interesting presentation. Last February, when Russia first entered into Ukraine, everyone believed that Russia would go for cyber attack. However, it was not as much as people expected. But Professor Ishii mentioned that the Ukraine government with the IT army did some actions against the Ukraine's invasion. So based on that international combat law, it was interesting to hear her opinions about civilians' status and the national responsibilities of the Ukraine government. As the moderator, I would like to ask you a question for later comments. So, international law could be applied to the cyberspace, but then usually in the West, people believe that the international humanitarian law can be applied to the cyberspace. However, non-Western part of the world is not sure. There are some people who are wondering. But then Professor Ishii mentioned the Geneva Convention and the international law. So the application of the law may become an option that influences on the cyberspace. So what kind of implication you believe that there will be? So maybe that's something that you can think of during our discussion later on. Now, I would like to turn to the floor to our domestic panelists who are with us today. Professor Yu Jun-gu. He's now visiting professor at a grad school of international studies at Hansen University. But earlier I said regarding cybersecurity, we have a very few scholars who studied international law, and actually Professor Yu is one of them, representing Korean academia. So I hope to hear great words from him. I will give you about 7 minutes. Professor Yu, please. As introduced, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. Regarding cybersecurity, norms and international laws have some legacies as a task for the future, and that's my focus and interest as the future tasks. And I would like to touch upon that during my comments in the discussion. In the cyberspace with the cyber technology, there are some interesting intrinsic characteristics, and there are some pending issues.
아무래도 그 융합, 컨버전시
First, issues of convergence. It could be inter-issue convergence or inter-technological convergence. And regarding inter-issue convergence, we can link the culture, you can link with the culture with some technology, and in the international context, and some issues are integrated and converged, and there are some new patterns which require new norms and international standards. And second, regarding cognition, there is a big gap. The first OGWG introduced that fundamentalize human rights and sovereignty, and these three need to be balanced. And there are some different views among governments regarding these three views. And we have some issues of building new norms and standards. Last but not least, because of these two reasons, we can think of coherence among regulations, which still lacks. For example, there was mention of IHL, and all P5 should be influenced under IHL, but in the technology, it is not just about using the internet. ICT, IoT, and other sensing technologies are the basics of our current cyber technologies. And other emerging technologies related to aerospace are emerging in the meantime. And there are some areas between technologies. So we have some different opinions, and we can't never pull out some social convergence. So that's why we do have some pending issues between regulations. First, as moderator explained well, government to government or non-government to non-government issues should be distinguished and it should be resolved. So here we can think of a responsible state behavior. In the aerospace, we can think of responsible behavior after taking off the word state. So depending on the space, whether it's the cyberspace or the actual offline space, we have different discourse. Second, norm in the cyberspace depends on wartime or peacetime, and whether we have to discuss together or individually or within the region. You can think of hybrid type of war like Ukraine war. and to apply the existing norms and regulations and the standards, it may be tricky. So against this backdrop, finally, what we have to do as scholar between countries and between the two sides of the words, we have to reaffirm the report, but OEWG want word by word and sense by sense to review the report. And that is the new type of conflict. And IHL, regarding armed conflict, sometimes can be applied only to the armed conflict. So there are some disputes. And we can also think of a new agenda regarding norm. For example, supply chain regarding data security has to be reviewed. Whether we should discuss in the same context as we did in the past, or depending on how you see the supply chain, there might be some cognition gap. And these are some new agenda we can think of. And last but not least, what kind of formatting we should consider to have all these discourse. And Professor Bang No-hyung, in 1998, when we had only 2% of the populations using the internet, now it's over 80% of using the internet in Korea. And Professor Park once mentioned that the new platform is required, like many other new technologies, as we used to emerge new technologies. So in this context, do we have to focus on implementation of new technologies, or we have to remain the existing framework? And that's another formatting issue that we can think of. And that's the task lie ahead of us. Probably, maybe in the future, detailed norms and standard could be further discussed in our discussion time. Thank you.
유 교수,
Thank you very much, Professor Yu. So what you mentioned, actually, you gave us quite a packed idea. I mean, it's a digest of, say, a one-year talk. So thank you very much. And actually, I am studying this field, and again, thank you for your comment.
이-
And these kind of cybersecurity norms, we have to connect some space laws and LSW, and there are a lot of things that are going on. So we have to arrange this. So a question from myself as moderator. So cyber or not? We're talking at OIWG. So briefly speaking, in the cyberspace, do we have to have any agreements in the cybersecurity? So non-Western countries are talking about that, and Western countries say that we don't need any agreement. We will talk about that more during our second round. What needs to be done, where we can be headed, so please elaborate on that issue. Now our second discussant.
위험
Professor Nam Seung-hyun from Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Actually, Professor Nam is the youngest of us. Still, he's a very prominent professional, and his fields include cyber-related things. Professor Nam, you have about 7 minutes. Thank you very much. So I want to mention cybersecurity and human rights. So currently, when we talk about cybersecurity and international norms, the human right issue keeps popping up. So when it comes to international relations, the cybersecurity is rather a national issue. So it's kind of international. It's not an international thing. So we don't actually look at human rights. So one example here is because it is only for one nation, a cyber attack may cause internet shutdown. And there might be privacy issues, right of speech. All these rights can be hindered. So, and the freedom of labor and the rights of education, all these things are deteriorated. And national hacking, again, there's an issue of privacy, and there might be execution or imprisonment and all kinds of human right issue related for that. More recently, there's been countries like China and Vietnam. Actually, they force more things on the internet, so the human rights violation is getting more and more attention. Recently, there's been the spread of COVID-19, Korea, China, Israel, and there was a tracking of privacy, and that's a privacy issue as well. It's a violation of personal rights. Professor Yu already mentioned that these new technologies will also affect the norm, and now it started to affect the human rights and surveillance with big data and AI. We're seeing an unprecedented type of human rights violation. So we keep saying the international bodies about the importance of cybersecurity related to privacy. So to protect human rights, there has to be some kind of safeguards for protection. In OEWG also, they had this session about cybersecurity and privacy security. And in the UNGGE report, they also mentioned briefly about this privacy issue. And according to Norm 13, it dates back to 2012. They're mentioning the privacy in the digital era, that we have to protect the personal data and privacy. So the stem of this, that the human rights needs to be protected regardless of on or offline. So for human rights protection on the cyberspace, every country have to make a legislation, and all these legislation should be in line with the global human rights law. And we have to prevent negative effects on the more vulnerable groups or civil society. That is something that countries have to think of. And to prevent human rights violation, we have to come up with international bodies that can actually prevent effectively these violations. And we will also have to come up with many things as well. And international cooperation is also important. And to make each parties believe each other. So these policies related to human rights needs to be there. And to prevent human rights in the cybersecurity, the role of private companies is more important than ever. According to UN report, it is not legally binding, but it talks about how enterprises have responsibility of protecting human rights. So that is very meaningful. And based on that declaration, the responsibility of private companies, actually it will expand through the cybersecurity, and there have to be more things that needs to be done. Recently, Korean government actually mentioned the actually played a lead role at the UN to for the adoption of this UN declaration. So we were talking about the digital era privacy issue, digital era human rights. There were a lot of reports out there in UN. But after this adoption of declaration of the new technologies, there was a demand, and the Korean government actually took a leading position related to this. And the Korean government is searching further how to continue this dialogue. So the cyberspace human right issue is right there, and the new technologies that Korean government wants to lead. There needs to be further discourse and further thoughts on this. Thank you.
네, 우리 남 교수님께서
Professor Nam mentioned about some discourse regarding cybersecurity safety. Thank you. In fact, from Professor Ishii's presentation, you can learn that cyber operation does not have boundary of the country. Sometimes they use cell phones, they go through games, and that means that you go through individuals. So it could be victims or perpetrators, and I believe to think of the boundary at the national level or in individual level, it's important. There's an annual progress report to discuss gender issues, focusing on female individuals and how important female individuals are. For personal information or privacy, that's the area I'm highly interested in, but I still have to study a lot about cybersecurity regarding personal information. I do have a question, though, to Professor Nam. You mentioned that Korean government at the UN Security Council played an important role in terms of cybersecurity, and in the course of adopting a resolution, there are some conflicts between sides. And were there any conflicts in the course of adopting resolution, or is there any specific remarks that we have to keep an eye on regarding this matter? So that's the question I will like to hear from you later. Last but not least, we do have a person from the government side, Director Kim Sura of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Department of the International Security Division. I asked why she didn't come on site, and she has an extremely busy schedule, and it's been a long time since I get to discuss some issues with some government official. It's wonderful to host a government official in our session. I appreciate it in advance. Thank you, Professor Park. My name is Kim Sura. I just wish that I could visit Jeju anytime soon, and I just wish that I could see you in person. We just came back from the UN meeting last weekend, and Professor Ishii Yurika and Director Fergus Hansen also mentioned that it's very important to discuss this cyberspace. And I actually worked in Russia, and I just came back just only 4 weeks ago. So I apologize once again that I couldn't make it to the session in person. Thank you again for the invitation. I just want to start my talk about Russia. As Professor Ishii mentioned, when it comes to hybrid battle and it's hybrid war, a lot of people call this Ukraine war hybrid. I was actually in Russia, as I mentioned, and Ukraine IT troops and a warrior actually attacked Russian government's offices in a cyberspace. And as a diplomat, it's important to collect lots of data and secure the data. And we had to work with the office of the president, and we were not even able to get access to the presidential office by DDoS attack. And we clicked some pages the whole night, and we were not able to get access. So that I had a very first-hand experience. As Director Hansen mentioned, Russian government is interested in the information control, but they do not do the control or censorship just like the China does. But they are interested in the surveillance of the information trading and transaction behind the scene when people freely share any data and information, and they actually stop people from doing so. So to tackle cyber threats, as mentioned, cannot be resolved by a sole effort of a country. We all have cell phones, and that means that our individual behaviors can affect. So, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea seeks international cooperation to tackle these cybersecurity issues at the global level. And against that backdrop, our capability to tackle cybersecurity issues is one of our priority. And to do so, we strengthen our alliance with our partner countries. And as Professor Yu mentioned, we need a new norm and standards. And the ministry is highly interested in that area as well. And we also reinforce the implementation of the norms and standards. In particular, creating norms and laws of the cybersecurity is my next talking point. As I mentioned, until September 12th, I participated in the UN meeting for 2 weeks. In 2019, Russia suggested a resolution to create such a committee, and that was the third meeting of its kind. And until then, the interim committee didn't play a full role, while there was a big list of questions with 50 different items. So it was hard for the interim community. So Western countries, China and Russia, were active to form the official committee. Next January in Vienna, we will have another opportunity to create a draft of new norms and laws and regulations about cybersecurity through this UN meeting. From this meeting, just finished 2 weeks ago, interim committee was already working and still in operation. So as a transitional period, the committee's new task is to include and reflect everyone's opinion from China and Russia. China and Russia didn't join the Budapest Convention for the same reason, because they believe that this is some sort of infringement of their sovereignty. So they kept speaking up with their opinions. So regarding that, Korea hopes that the new norms and laws should limit themselves just to tackle cybersecurity, so that the other countries do not misunderstand this new norms and laws. And that was what we expressed during the UN meeting. Then let me move on to the existing convention. So we had a Budapest Convention to start with. In 2001, it was adopted. Now, Japan, Australia, and 27 other countries joined this convention. After 2011, we were invited and we started our review. And in 2017, we started a full-on discussion whether we should join this convention. And we did collected a consensus that it's better for us to join. But in the course of finalizing our commitment to join the committee, but our current president mentioned about joining the Budapest Convention, so now my ministry is working on it. In July, President reaffirmed his willingness to join Budapest Convention, and the Deputy Minister of the Foreign Affairs also mentioned that no later than the September this year, we should at least submit our willingness to join the Budapest Convention. And accordingly, we are providing the departmental effort. Budapest Convention stipulates cybersecurity issues in detail and describes the process of how to treat, and jurisdiction is in it as well. And it also has the international coordination matters in the convention. Because China and Russia refuse to join Budapest Convention. That's why the convention looked up that possibilities of infringement of the sovereignty. So from our ministry's perspective, by joining this convention, it will accelerate our international coordination with our counterparts around the globe. So our priority is to hand in our application. Sorry I took too long, and I will stop here, and later I will participate further discussion, and I'm ready to answer any of the questions. Thank you for listening.
네, 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much, Director. And that was a good discussion on how things are going on, because in the past, the European Committee is different from EU. In the European Council, Russia is actually with the European Council. In the CCC, Russia is a member of the Council, but Director Kim just mentioned that the other country's government can actually have access to the other country's company without even the local government. So this is the reason why Russia is against that. And China says that Budapest Convention is only for European countries, so they were quite evading them. So my question to Director Kim is, then Russia and China, and actually Russia is actually leading this pact, so then what about the results? So can these results adopted as a resolution of the UN? And compared to the Budapest Convention, will it be different that much? Because the Budapest Convention has adopted its second protocol,
그
and it's kind of expanding the law enforcement. So that actually this is what's happening right now. So the future UN convention, when compared to Budapest Convention, please elaborate on that issue. Actually, I was talking too much. I'm sorry for that. So, Director Hansen.
먼저 드린 질문을 그냥 짧게
I would like to hear that little question about that the ITU Director General election. Depending on the future Director General will be American or Russian, I'm sure it will change the entire horizon of the cybersecurity. I would like to hear your take on that.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Park, and it's been great to hear the other speakers as well. Some very interesting conversation. I think this was dubbed the most important election that you've never heard of. The ITU election that's coming up, and that's pitted the Russian candidate against the American candidate. It's a very Cold War redux that we've got there. Look, I think this is a really important election because people haven't been ashamed to, hiding what this is all about. It's about the future of the internet and the vision that we have for it. Now, this has been going on for a long time, whether we're going to have this authoritarian vision for the internet or a free and open internet that democratic states and others around the world have been pushing for a long time. So I think this is really just bringing that to a real head. It's exacerbated by the fact that the candidates are pitching exactly along these lines. So I think it will really make a big difference. If we do see the Russians having the numbers to push this kind of approach, particularly in an environment where we've seen such a flagrant violation of international law with the invasion of Ukraine, then I think it does bode pretty badly for the way that the internet will see that play out. I would anticipate that would mean a group of authoritarian-minded states splintering off on one side, potentially if they can co-opt the ITU processes, and a group of democratically minded states to splinter off another way. Of course, the internet has been splintering for a very long time, and we already essentially have at least two internets, maybe more. So I think the other challenge for democratic states and those that favour the free and open internet is to calibrate their message. We've got to come up with something that's a bit more than a cliche that is sort of meaningless words of free and open. I think we really need to talk precisely about what it is that we're pushing for and what that actually means. We've had sort of hollow language for a long time that doesn't precisely articulate what it is that's the positive vision that we're pushing for. So I think we do need to work on that. Simultaneously, I think we need to sort of try and find a way to strike a vision that's going to appeal to a broader group of states. There is clearly a desire to be able to control aspects of the internet for different state purposes, and we probably need to think of a way to try and strike some sort of balance there that achieves the baked-in values and principles that we want to see, but also provides some level of way of addressing legitimate claims to things like lawful access and things like that states seem to be pushing for. So I might leave it there in the interest of time and the many questions still to go.
네, 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much, Director Hansen. And my next question to Professor Ishii related to the Ukrainian crisis, whether we can apply the ILT. So where are we headed? Whether the IHL cyberspace can be applied to Ukraine in the future? That is my question.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the interesting conversations and presentations. I think the question is quite difficult one, but from the international law perspective, I mentioned that there's a clear distinction between the so-called the peacetime law and the law of armed conflict. And once an international armed conflict occurs, then IHL to be applied. Now the question is about does the IHL does not necessarily expect the situation where the type will occur, and as we saw in this conversation, the IHL is not sufficient to govern many acts, including larger hack the Ukraine army. Now we have the Tally Manual, which is an influential resource for legal advisors and policy experts dealing with cyber issues. It discusses the situation where IHL was in a cyber domain. But it is still a manual, and it does not necessarily discuss the situation where we, call for voluntary conduct. So I think the rules have not been well established. The other question is whether the peacetime law in the cyber domain to apply the situation of the international conflict. Now, allows the states to conduct the act of hostilities, which is not permissible in a peacetime situation. So there is limits to regulate the conduct of the state parties to the international armed conflict because it is their right to conduct action. However, as Professor Park mentioned, the conduct of the state parties to the armed conflict immediately affect the users' custody, and that might, adversely affect the interests of the neutral states. So I think that we should consider the possibility to limit cyber operations in the context of international armed conflict. But as we are looking at in the Russian-Ukraine war, I think that the goal is far. That will stop here.
예, 고맙습니다. 시간이 이제 지금
Thank you. We only have 1 minute left, unfortunately, so I would like to hear very short closing remarks from all three of the panel discussants. So to answer your question, moderator, in cyberspace, there are some vacant situations, and there's a possibility of a cyber attack kicks in, but we need an imminent responses, and that's our task and challenges. So at the end of the day, one size fits all may be possible, or we have to go through issue by issue. We have to do issue by issue approach. Probably issue by issue approach probably is more realistic for the region. And there are over 100 cybersecurity norms. And that's how we can benefit ourselves from all the advantages of a cybersecurity norms. And that wraps my comments. Thank you. Professor Nam?
Yes. So you talked about the resolution and the confrontation between the two parties. And so first of all, so I'm not in the diplomatic field myself, so I might not answer very correctly, but as far as I know, in China, they are against this agreement. And from European countries, conventionally, they are for human rights. So they are quite supportive for this agreement. And a peculiar thing is actually we are leading this agreement. And there's a working group of the council, human rights, and the companies. They are starting this VTech project. And inside that, they're talking about new technologies and human rights. When talking about the responsibilities of the company in this working group, actually this group is EU-centered. So our resolution, actually it is shifting rather, I would say EU-centered from our government perspective. There's a little bit of worries, and we're now thinking about how we can pull them to Asia and Korean countries. So that is what the Korean government is thinking. Thank you very much. So please allow 2 or more 3 minutes. Yes. Okay. So Director Kim will finish the discussion. Thank you.
But I'll make it short to make sure. It's been a long time. So regarding your question, Mr. Moderator, UN Convention about cybersecurity and the Budapest Convention, and you asked me about my outlook and perspective. It is too early for me to predict. However, what I can tell you is that we will have a draft by January next year, and that's our imminent plan. So first, I have to create the draft to discuss that with you, Mr. Moderator. But my impression is that this convention is not going to the direction where China and Russia favors. And there are some points that make sense from their side. And if you think of the Cybersecurity Convention, we should not expend this effort to have this norm to cover the entire elements and aspect of the cybersecurity. So that doesn't go along with the basic philosophy of the foundation of the convention. So like many other conventions, Korea should keep an eye in that regard. And also for Budapest Convention, as we want to join as much as possible, and we do not want to see any other conventions coming up in the future that has some conflicts against the Budapest Convention. So that's not an ideal situation. So that's the way that we are going to comply with some UN conventions and providing some feedback. Thank you, Director Kim. 80 minutes is very short, and I tried to shorten my comments as a moderator, but to wrap up, I thought of 2 things. We will have next year's Jeju Forum, and based on our conversation today, this is not just a regular or general cyber session regarding cyber human rights, regarding IHL, and we do need a bigger session regarding cybersecurity. And we would like to really want to see Director Hansen and Professor Ishihi in person next year in our offline session. Once again, sorry for the time delay, and I would like to appreciate all the presenters and panelists and audience. Thank you, and have a great evening.
이상으로
This concludes today's session. Thank you very much for staying until the end.